episode 73, titled Bands and Channels 2.4, 5, 6 GHz Trade-offs and Overlap Problems, the goal is to treat band choice as a deliberate balance between range, speed, and interference rather than as a default setting you accept from the vendor. Wireless bands are not interchangeable, and the exam uses them as scenario cues because the band determines how far signal travels, how many usable channels exist, and how crowded the spectrum is likely to be. Band selection also influences how you plan channel widths and how you avoid self-inflicted interference when you deploy many access points close together. Most wireless problems in dense environments are not caused by lack of coverage, but by contention and overlap, where too many clients and too many radios share too little clean spectrum. If you understand what each band tends to provide and what it tends to suffer from, you can interpret slow speed complaints and unstable performance patterns more quickly. The exam expects you to reason about trade-offs, not to declare one band best, because the correct answer depends on density and environmental constraints. This episode builds that trade-off logic and ties it to practical channel planning decisions. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. 2.4 GHz reaches farther and penetrates obstacles better, which is why it often appears to provide coverage when other bands struggle, but it also suffers heavy congestion and overlap in most real environments. 2.4 GHz is widely used by many devices and is shared with many non-Wi-Fi technologies, which increases noise and interference even before you consider neighboring networks. It also offers fewer non-overlapping channels, meaning that in dense deployments, multiple access points are forced to reuse the same channel, creating co-channel contention and reducing throughput. This is why 2.4 GHz often becomes the band of last resort for legacy devices and for coverage in hard-to-reach areas, not the band you rely on for high performance. The exam tests this by presenting scenarios where users connect on 2.4 GHz and experience poor speeds during busy periods, even though signal strength looks acceptable. The long reach is a double-edged sword because it increases the size of each cell, meaning more clients share the same airtime and more access points hear each other, increasing contention. In practice, the more access points you deploy, the more 2.4 GHz becomes crowded by your own radios as well. When you see 2.4 GHz in a scenario, think range benefits, but capacity constraints and congestion risk. 5 GHz generally offers more channels and better capacity, which is why it is often the workhorse band for enterprise wireless performance. More channels means more opportunities to distribute access points across different frequencies, reducing co-channel interference in dense environments. 5 GHz also tends to have less interference from non-Wi-Fi devices compared to 2.4 GHz, though it is not free of contention in crowded areas. The shorter wavelength compared to 2.4 GHz usually means somewhat reduced range and penetration, which can be beneficial because smaller cells can increase frequency reuse and reduce contention when designed correctly. The exam expects you to recognize 5 GHz as the band that typically supports higher throughput and better user experience in modern deployments, assuming clients are capable and the environment supports it. Channel planning is still necessary because poor automatic choices can still create overlap, but the band provides more room to work. 5 GHz is also where channel width decisions become impactful, because wider channels can improve throughput for a client in isolation, but reduce the number of distinct channels available in the environment. When you view 5 GHz as capacity-oriented, you naturally pair it with density planning and careful channel width selection. 6 GHz offers clean spectrum with shorter range and additional requirements, and it is often used as a scenario hint for modern deployments that can take advantage of new spectrum. Clean spectrum means fewer legacy devices and fewer neighboring networks using it, which can reduce interference and improve throughput, especially in dense environments where older bands are saturated. The shorter range is not a flaw. It is a characteristic, and it can support high-density designs because smaller cells allow more reuse when access points are placed appropriately. The requirements aspect matters because not all clients support 6 GHz, and environments must consider how devices discover and connect to it, which can involve additional operational planning. The exam uses 6 GHz as a hint that the environment is trying to achieve higher performance and lower interference through newer capabilities, but it also expects you to acknowledge that range is shorter and that adoption is not universal. 6 GHz works best when access point density is sufficient and when client populations include modern devices that can benefit from it. It can also change how you think about channel width, because clean spectrum may allow wider channels without creating immediate overlap, though density still matters. When you see 6 GHz in a scenario, think clean spectrum opportunity paired with shorter reach and capability requirements. Channel overlap causes co-channel interference, which is the condition where multiple access points and clients compete for airtime on the same channel, and it can cause throughput collapse even when signal strength is strong. Co-channel interference is not always noise in the classic sense, because Wi-Fi devices can hear each other and take turns, but that turn-taking becomes the bottleneck when many devices share one channel. As the number of competing transmitters rises, each gets a smaller share of airtime, latency rises, and throughput drops, especially during busy hours. Overlap can also be self-inflicted, meaning your own access points can create the contention if channels are reused too aggressively or if channel width is too wide for the available spectrum. This is why dense deployments can perform worse after adding more access points if channel planning is not adjusted, because you have increased the number of transmitters without increasing available spectrum. The exam tests overlap problems by describing environments where performance collapses during busy periods, even though coverage seems adequate, and the root cause is often contention rather than weak signal. Understanding co-channel interference helps you choose narrower channels, better channel assignments, and band steering to reduce contention. When you see throughput collapse with good signal, think overlap and airtime competition. Using narrower channels in crowded areas is a practical directive because it increases the number of distinct channels available, reducing co-channel contention. Narrower channels reduce peak throughput per client in ideal conditions, but in dense environments, the limiting factor is often airtime sharing rather than raw channel width. By using narrower channels, you can place adjacent access points on different channels more often, reducing the number of radios that must share the same frequency. This improves overall capacity and reduces the chance of throughput collapse during peak usage. The exam expects you to recognize that the best design for dense offices is not necessarily maximum channel width, but rather controlled width that supports reuse and predictable performance. Narrow channels also reduce the size of interference footprints, meaning an access point's transmissions have a smaller frequency footprint, which helps adjacent channels coexist. This is a classic trade-off of less per link peak, more overall stability, which aligns with real enterprise goals. When you choose narrow channels, you are optimizing for aggregate experience across many clients, not for a single speed test. Using wider channels only when spectrum is clean and sparse is the complementary directive because wide channels consume more spectrum and therefore reduce the number of non-overlapping options. In a sparse environment, such as a home, a small office, or a warehouse with low access point density, wide channels can deliver higher throughput because there are fewer neighboring transmitters competing for the same spectrum. Wide channels can also benefit applications that need high burst throughput, such as large downloads or media streaming, when the environment does not have many competing access points. The exam expects you to understand that wide channel use is a situational choice, not a default that works everywhere. In dense deployments, wide channels can cause self-interference because fewer unique channels exist, forcing reuse and increasing contention. Wide channels also increase the chance that an access point overlaps with multiple neighbors, creating larger interference domains. When spectrum is clean, wide channels can be an advantage, but when spectrum is crowded, they can be destructive to overall performance. The correct reasoning is to match channel width to density and spectrum availability. A common scenario is 2.4 GHz causing slow speeds during busy hours because clients fall back to that band due to its stronger signal and then contend for limited spectrum. In a dense office, many access points and many clients can end up sharing the same few channels, and the band becomes saturated quickly. Users may see full signal bars, yet experience slow web browsing, delayed calls, and poor video quality because airtime is congested. This problem is often amplified by legacy devices and Internet of Things devices that prefer 2.4 GHz and transmit frequently, increasing contention. The exam expects you to interpret this scenario as a band and channel planning issue, not as a general Wi-Fi is slow complaint. Mitigation often includes encouraging capable clients to use 5 GHz or 6 GHz through steering, reducing 2.4 GHz coverage where appropriate, and using narrower channels with careful reuse planning. It also includes reviewing automatic channel selection because if access points cluster on the same channel, performance collapses quickly. When you can connect busy hour slowness on 2.4 GHz to contention, you can choose design actions that address the root cause. Automatic channel choices can conflict across adjacent access points, which is a common pitfall because each access point may make channel decisions locally without global context, creating overlap hotspots. If multiple access points select the same channel in the same area, they create a large contention domain where many clients must share airtime. This can happen when access points reboot, when environmental conditions change, or when default algorithms respond to perceived interference in ways that cause convergence on the same channels. The exam tests this by describing unpredictable performance changes after equipment changes, or by hinting that channels are set to automatic and problems appear in specific areas. Automatic selection can be useful, but it must be guided by constraints and monitored, especially in dense environments where global planning matters. A coordinated approach, whether through controller-based management or disciplined planning, reduces the chance of local decisions creating global problems. When automatic behavior is not tuned, it can lead to oscillation and instability as access points keep changing channels, causing clients to reconnect and performance to fluctuate. Recognizing this pitfall helps you recommend controlled channel planning rather than blind automation. Using maximum width everywhere is another pitfall because it creates self-interference by reducing channel reuse options and increasing overlap between neighboring access points. In dense deployments, wide channels mean fewer distinct channels, so access points must reuse channels more often and overlap with more neighbors, increasing co-channel contention. This can make performance worse, even though each access point is theoretically capable of higher throughput. It also increases the chance that clients at the edge of coverage hear multiple strong transmitters on the same wide channel, which increases contention and reduces usable airtime. The exam tests this by describing an environment where channel width is set to maximum for performance, and yet users experience poor performance, especially during peak usage. The correct reasoning is that wide channels are not inherently better in dense settings, and that overall capacity is driven by how well spectrum is reused. Reducing width can increase stability and aggregate throughput, even if it reduces peak throughput for a single client in isolation. When you understand this, you avoid the trap of configuring for speed tests rather than for real user experience. Quick wins include separating SSIDs by band and steering capable clients, because you want modern clients to use the bands that provide better capacity while preserving compatibility where needed. Separate SSIDs can give users and devices a clear choice, though it can also add complexity, so the design must be intentional. Steering means encouraging clients to prefer 5 GHz or 6 GHz when they are capable, reducing load on 2.4 GHz and improving overall experience. Steering can be combined with careful 2.4 GHz power tuning so that clients do not cling to 2.4 GHz simply because the signal appears stronger. The exam expects you to understand that band steering is a capacity control and that managing client distribution across bands is part of performance design. These quick wins also include monitoring channel utilization and contention so you can see whether steering is working and whether overlap remains. Separating SSIDs is not required in every environment, but the exam often treats it as a concept to show intentional band management. When you manage band usage intentionally, you reduce the chance that legacy band congestion dictates everyone's experience. A useful memory anchor is range, capacity, channels, overlap, choose deliberately, because it captures the decision factors that drive band and channel planning. Range reminds you that 2.4 GHz reaches farther, while 5 and 6 GHz typically have shorter effective coverage, which influences cell size and placement. Capacity reminds you that 5 and 6 GHz often provide better overall capacity due to more channels and less congestion, especially in modern deployments. Channels reminds you that the number of usable channels and their widths determine how well you can reuse spectrum without contention. Overlap reminds you that co-channel interference can collapse throughput even when signal is strong, making channel planning essential. Choose deliberately reminds you that automatic defaults often fail in dense environments, and that width and band decisions must match density and client capability. This anchor helps you interpret scenarios where performance collapses at busy times because the root cause is often contention and overlap rather than weak coverage. When you apply the anchor, you naturally ask what band clients are using, how channels are reused, and whether width is appropriate for density. That structured thinking is what the exam expects. To apply the concept, imagine choosing a band strategy for a dense office versus a home, and match the strategy to density and interference reality. In a dense office, you generally want capable clients to use 5 GHz and 6 GHz because they provide more capacity and more channels, and you want to keep 2.4 GHz available mainly for legacy and special devices. You also want narrower channels to increase reuse and reduce contention, and you want coordinated channel planning to avoid overlap hotspots across many access points. In a home, you have fewer access points and fewer neighbors, so you can often use wider channels on 5 GHz or 6 GHz for higher peak throughput, while keeping 2.4 GHz for range and for devices that need it. The exam expects you to show that the same settings do not fit both environments because density and spectrum cleanliness differ. You also consider client mix, because a home may have many Internet of Things devices that prefer 2.4 GHz, while a dense office may have modern laptops and phones that can benefit from newer bands. When you justify band strategy based on density and client capability, you demonstrate correct decision patterns. To close episode 73, titled Bands and Channels, 2.4, 5, 6 GHz Trade-offs and Overlap Problems, the key is to balance range, capacity, and interference by choosing bands and channel widths that fit the environment. 2.4 GHz offers range but suffers congestion and limited non-overlapping options. 5 GHz offers more channels and generally better capacity, and 6 GHz offers cleaner spectrum with shorter range and capability requirements. Channel overlap creates co-channel interference that can collapse throughput during busy hours, even when signal strength is strong, which is why channel planning matters more than raw transmit power. Narrower channels are often the right choice in crowded environments to increase reuse and reduce contention, while wider channels are best reserved for clean and sparse spectrum where overlap risk is low. Automatic channel decisions and maximum width everywhere are common pitfalls that create overlap hotspots and self-interference. Quick wins like band steering and intentional SSID management help move capable clients to higher capacity bands and reduce load on congested spectrum. Your rehearsal assignment is a channel planning rehearsal where you narrate which band and width choices you would make for a dense office, how you would prevent overlap hotspots, and how you would confirm that clients are using the intended bands. Because that narration is how you show band and channel reasoning the way the exam expects. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.